Winter arrived early in Northumberland that year, laying its authority upon the land with a silence that felt judicial, as though even the wind had been summoned to witness what was about to be undone. Snow smothered the iron gates of Raven's Hollow estate, dulling their proud crests and muting the crunch of carriage wheels beyond them, while within the grounds servants lingered at a cautious distance, sensing that history, or humiliation, was about to pass between two figures standing exposed beneath the falling white. England in 1817 was a nation ruled as much by whispers as by law, and reputations, once fractured, rarely survived the season. The Duke of Raven's Hollow stood rigid near the gates, his dark coat buttoned high, his posture impeccable, as though discipline alone might shield him from weakness. At 25, he possessed the advantages of birth, education, and a beauty sharpened by restraint. Yet his expression bore the fatigue of a man older than his years. Since boyhood, he had been instructed that his life was not his own, that the ducal line, strained by political miscalculation and dwindling influence, required repair through alliances, not affection. Only months earlier, beneath candlelight and solemn vows, he had sworn a private oath to secure his family's power, even if it demanded the sacrifice of his own desires. Lady Leonora Ashcombe stood opposite him, her gloved hands folded with deliberate calm, her breath faintly visible as it rose and vanished into the winter air. At 22, she was spoken of in drawing rooms with admiration softened by pity, for beauty such as hers invited attention even when society had begun to turn its gaze away. Her features held a rare harmony, but it was her composure that lingered longest in memory, an elegance shaped not by wealth but by careful endurance. Once welcomed into the most discerning circles, she now carried the burden of her father's name, tarnished by an accusation of treason never proven yet never forgotten, and a fortune reduced to shadows. They had loved each other quietly, deliberately, believing for a time that discretion might outlast consequence. Yet secrecy, like snow, has a way of revealing every hidden footprint. When Leonora learned that the Duke intended to bind himself to another, a woman chosen not for tenderness, but for strategic advantage, she requested this final meeting, refusing to fade into silence without dignity. Standing there, she spoke without accusation, her voice steady despite the cold, declaring that she would endure poverty, exile, even obscurity, but would not consent to being concealed as though affection were a crime. The Duke listened, his jaw tightening with each measured word, for her resolve threatened the careful architecture of his obedience. He loved her with a devotion that had startled him into humanity, yet fear held his heart in rigid captivity. He saw, with cruel clarity, the ruin that defiance could invite, not only upon himself, but upon generations yet unborn. And so, in a moment where courage might have altered everything, he chose preservation over truth. His voice emerged controlled, almost gentle, as he pronounced the sentence that would echo long after the snow had melted. "Go, never turn back, you're now my love." Leonora did not weep. She inclined her head once, as though acknowledging a formal decree, and turned away, her steps unhurried, her spine unbroken. The servants averted their eyes, the gates loomed indifferent, and she passed beyond them into a world that no longer promised shelter. Only when she disappeared into the white distance did the Duke feel the sharp betrayal of his own body. His breath shortened, his chest tightened, and for the first time authority failed him entirely. He remained there, alone and unsteady, realizing with a sudden, terrifying clarity that duty had spared his name, but had stolen the air from his lungs. Around him, Raven's Hollow stood unchanged, its windows glowing faintly with inherited certainty, yet he sensed that something essential had fractured beyond repair. The estate, once a symbol of permanence, now felt like a monument to fear, and the snow that gathered upon its steps seemed less a decoration than a burial shroud. In distant parlors and carriage-lined streets, rumors would soon begin their quiet migrations, shaping a narrative in which he would remain untarnished and she would bear the cost. The knowledge settled heavily upon him, for he understood, even then, that survival purchased through silence demanded a payment deferred, never forgiven. As twilight deepened and the bells of a neighboring parish marked the hour, he drew another breath with effort, unaware that this moment, frozen in winter, had already set in motion a reckoning that neither rank nor resolve could indefinitely postpone. Love, once denied voice, began its quiet, relentless return within him slowly. London received the news of Lady Leonora Ashcombe's disappearance from favor with the avidity it reserved for fallen stars, and within days her name passed from lips softened by admiration to tongues sharpened by judgment. Drawing rooms warmed by firelight echoed with speculation, each whisper embroidered with cruelty, until the truth itself became irrelevant. It was said she had aspired above her station, that she had presumed upon a duke's patience, that beauty unaccompanied by fortune was an offense best corrected by humiliation. Society congratulated itself on the neatness of her removal and turned eagerly to the next spectacle. Leonora, meanwhile, occupied 2 modest rooms in Bloomsbury, chosen for their anonymity rather than comfort. The curtains were thin, the hearth reluctant, yet she arranged the space with careful order, as though discipline alone might preserve her sense of self. Each morning she dressed with the same attention she once afforded grand occasions, refusing to let diminished circumstance erode her habits. When she ventured out, her head remained high, though invitations no longer followed her steps. She sold a pearl clasp, then a ring, then a bracelet inherited from her mother, not with despair but with quiet resolve, determined that survival would be earned, not begged. The Duke of Ravenshollow moved through London with an ease that now felt fraudulent. Applause greeted him at assemblies, doors opened at his approach, and polite inquiries followed him like trained companions. Yet beneath the practiced civility, his thoughts returned relentlessly to the image of Leonora walking away without reproach. He discovered that silence, once chosen, had not delivered peace but a persistent ache, as though the words he had forced upon her had lodged within his own chest. At night he slept poorly, waking with the sensation of breath interrupted, and dismissed it as fatigue born of excess responsibility. Rumors of his impending engagement surfaced with predictable enthusiasm. A suitable young woman, rich and well-connected, was proposed in half-amused confidence, as though the matter were already settled. The Duke neither confirmed nor denied the speculation, yet his restraint was interpreted as consent. Leonora heard of it through a distant acquaintance who offered the news with cautious sympathy, and though her expression remained composed, the knowledge pressed upon her like an unwelcome weight. She had accepted rejection, but the ease with which society repurposed their intimacy into convenience stung more sharply than dismissal. One afternoon, as snow softened the city's sharp edges, a small parcel arrived at Leonora's door, unmarked and carefully wrapped. Inside lay a slim volume of poetry, its binding familiar, its margins untouched save for a single penciled line beneath a verse on endurance and restraint. She recognized the Duke's hand immediately, the deliberate curve of each letter unmistakable, and for a moment her composure wavered. The gift offered no apology, no explanation, only remembrance, and that, she decided, was its greatest cruelty. She closed the book, wrapped it again, and returned it unopened, the messenger instructed to say nothing. The parcel's return unsettled the Duke more profoundly than any rebuke. The gesture stripped away the illusion that tenderness could be offered without accountability, and he found himself newly exposed to his own cowardice. Days later, during a formal gathering attended by members of the court, the room seemed to tilt without warning. The lights blurred, voices receded, and an invisible pressure seized his chest, forcing him to grasp the edge of a table for balance. Alarm spread quickly, decorum forgotten, as he collapsed before an audience accustomed to his certainty. Physicians spoke in murmurs of exhaustion, of stress, of a constitution overburdened by duty, yet none could name a cause sufficient to explain the violence of his distress. As he lay recovering in a quiet chamber, the noise of society momentarily distant, the Duke confronted a truth he had long evaded. The body, unlike rank, could not be persuaded by reason alone. Breath, once taken for granted, had become a fragile privilege, withdrawn in protest. Beyond the frosted window, London continued its indifferent rhythm, but within him something had shifted irrevocably. The choice he had made in winter had not ended the matter. It had merely postponed its reckoning, and that reckoning now waited, patient and unsparing, for his return to strength. Even as he closed his eyes, he understood that recovery would demand more than rest. Somewhere beyond the walls of privilege he had defended, a woman bore the cost of his obedience, and no physician could remedy that injury. The knowledge settled with quiet persistence, neither accusation nor plea, but a certainty he could no longer ignore. When strength returned to his limbs, it would carry him forward, not back into comfort, but toward a confrontation he had once feared more than loss itself, and consequence awaited. The Duke of Ravenshollow recovered slowly, not in body alone, but in perception, as though illness had stripped him of a protective veil and returned him to the world newly exposed. Confined to quiet rooms and measured hours, he found his thoughts no longer obedient to habit. They wandered instead to moments he had dismissed as resolved, replaying Leonora's composed departure with an insistence that bordered on accusation. The physicians pronounced him improved, yet he knew with unsettling clarity that his condition had never been purely physical. Breath had abandoned him because truth had been denied its place. When he rose again into motion, he did so without ceremony, declining social visits and delaying obligations that once governed him. In the seclusion of his family's London residence, he requested old documents long untouched, correspondence and parliamentary records sealed by discretion and dust. It was not curiosity that drove him, but a suspicion sharpened by regret. Night after night he read, piecing together fragments of policy and ambition, until a pattern emerged too precise to be accidental. Lady Ashcombe's father had not fallen by misjudgment, but by design, sacrificed to preserve alliances that now claimed moral authority. The knowledge struck with both clarity and shame. His own lineage had benefited from the silence that followed, and the oath he had sworn to protect its influence was rooted in an injustice that had shaped Leonora's exile. For the first time, the Duke recognized that love and duty had never been opposing forces, only honesty and fear. He understood then that his illness had been a warning, not of weakness, but of complicity. The choice before him no longer concerned affection alone, but the restoration of dignity long denied. Leonora, unaware of the depth of his discovery, continued her life with careful restraint. The city had not softened its regard, yet she met each day with the same composed defiance that had carried her through loss. When word reached her that the Duke had fallen ill, concern stirred unbidden, then was firmly set aside. Sympathy, she reminded herself, was not permission. She would not be summoned by regret alone, nor soothed by gestures emptied of courage. Whatever remained between them must now answer to truth. It was in the midst of a late winter storm that the Duke set out, his decision formed with a certainty that surprised even himself. Snow fell thick upon the roads, blurring boundaries and erasing distinctions, as though the world conspired to reduce him to a man unshielded by rank. The journey to Bloomsbury was slow, deliberate, each mile an act of resolve rather than haste. He arrived not with proclamation, but with humility, dismissing attendants and approaching her door alone. Leonora received him in a modest sitting room, its simplicity reflecting the life she had shaped without his protection. She did not invite familiarity, nor did she refuse him entirely. Courtesy governed their exchange, but beneath it lay a tension sharpened by restraint. The Duke spoke carefully, confessing not love first, but failure. He acknowledged the cruelty of his silence, the cowardice of his words, and the fear that had guided his choice. When he spoke of the records, of the truth concealed and now revealed, her composure faltered for the first time. Yet she did not yield to relief. Instead, She listened with an intensity that demanded consequence. She told him that affection offered in private meant nothing if injustice remained unchallenged in public. Her father's name, her family's ruin, and her own exile could not be redeemed by confession alone. If he sought absolution, it must be through exposure, not secrecy, even if such honesty dismantled the world that had protected him. The Duke accepted her terms without negotiation, recognizing in her demand the integrity he had once admired and then betrayed. When he departed, no promise passed between them beyond intention. The storm had lessened, but the path ahead remained treacherous, and both understood that resolution would require a confrontation far greater than their private reckoning. Leonora watched him go without certainty of his return, yet for the first time since winter's beginning, the weight upon her chest eased. Truth, once spoken, had altered the air between them. As the Duke made his way back into the city's heart, documents secured and resolve unbroken, he felt the faint return of unlabored breath. The realization steadied him, not with hope of reward, but with acceptance of cost. Ahead waited society, crown, and consequence, and beyond them the possibility of forgiveness not yet earned. The reckoning he had postponed now advanced with purpose, and he met it willingly, knowing that whatever followed would be shaped not by fear, but by the courage he had at last chosen to claim. Spring arrived without ceremony, melting the last remnants of winter as though England itself wished to forget the severity of what had passed. Yet within the halls of Parliament and the anterooms of court, memory sharpened rather than softened, for the Duke of Ravenshollow had returned not as a familiar ornament of privilege, but as an agent of disruption. When he presented the sealed records, their contents spoken aloud with deliberate clarity, the chamber stilled. Names once spoken with reverence were revealed as architects of falsehood, and among them lingered the shadow of his own house, exposed without mitigation. The consequences followed swiftly. Alliances cooled, invitations ceased, and the polite warmth that had once accompanied his presence withdrew with measured disdain. Yet the Duke stood unmoved, having surrendered the comfort of approval for the steadier ground of truth. In restoring the honor of a disgraced man, he dismantled the inheritance that had demanded his silence, and though his title endured, it did so stripped of illusion. England murmured, uncertain whether to condemn or admire him, but the narrative had shifted, and Lady Leonora Ashcombe's name emerged from whispers cleansed of suspicion. It was beneath a pale sky outside St. Margaret's, where the city breathed between tradition and change, that he sought her once more. Snow no longer fell, yet the air carried the clarity of aftermath, as though the world had been washed of pretense. Leonora approached alone, her bearing unchanged by vindication, for dignity, once learned, did not depend upon applause. She listened as the Duke spoke, not of sacrifice, but of certainty, declaring before witnesses that love unspoken had nearly undone him, and that without her he had learned the true cost of breath withheld. His words, measured and resolute, offered no defense, only allegiance freely given. He did not kneel, nor did he dramatize his confession, for he understood that equality, not spectacle, must define what followed. Leonora regarded him in silence, weighing not his courage, but its endurance. When she accepted his hand, it was not as a rescued woman, but as one restored to her rightful place by truth rather than favor. Their marriage followed in due season, marked less by grandeur than by intention. Bells rang not in triumph, but in acknowledgement, and society attended with cautious curiosity, uncertain whether they witnessed a reconciliation or reformation. Within the vows exchanged lay no promises of ease, only fidelity shaped by knowledge hard-earned. The Duke relinquished ambitions once inherited unquestioned, choosing instead a life governed by conscience, while Leonora, no longer burdened by injustice, allowed herself at last the unguarded tenderness she had long withheld. Yet, even in resolution, the story resisted finality. Love had prevailed, but not without cost, and the world they entered together remained vigilant, prepared always to measure worth by advantage. As they departed the church, sunlight breaking through retreating clouds, the Duke drew a full, unlabored breath, aware that peace was not a gift bestowed, but a practice sustained. Leonora, beside him, felt no need to look back, for what had been lost had yielded something rarer than restoration. England would remember the scandal, the exposure, and the defiance, recording them as footnotes to power and precedent. What endured beyond record, however, was the quieter transformation of two lives redirected by honesty. Winter had taught them restraint, suffering had refined resolve, and love, once denied voice, had reshaped their future without apology. As the carriage carried them forward into a season neither promised nor feared, the air itself seemed to affirm what they had learned too late, and yet in time, that dignity and devotion, when finally aligned, leave no room for regret. In the weeks that followed, adjustments were made quietly and without appeal. Estates were reorganized, households reduced, and expectations recalibrated, yet neither lamented what was relinquished. The Duke discovered that authority unaccompanied by fear possessed a different gravity, one that required listening rather than command. Leonora, freed from the vigilance that survival had demanded, began to shape a presence grounded not in defense, but in contribution, lending her intelligence to causes long neglected by those who mistook comfort for virtue. Together they learned that marriage, like truth, was not a conclusion, but an undertaking, sustained by attention and courage renewed daily. Their union did not silence gossip entirely, nor did it seek to, for both understood that history rarely grants full absolution. Still, as seasons advanced and their steps aligned, the murmurs lost urgency, replaced by the quieter acknowledgement that something enduring had taken root, resistant to erosion, and quietly transformative in its persistence. And so the tale, though settled in affection, remained open to time, inviting reflection, reminding all who observe that love chosen honestly reshapes even the most unforgiving world with quiet, lasting consequence.